Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Leigh Armistead, who is the president of Peregrine Technical Solutions and the chief editor of the Journal of Information Warfare. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, earned a master's degree in military history from Old Dominion University, and a doctorate in computer and information science from Edith Cowan University. Leigh Armistead, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you inviting me.
Could you please give our audience a little more information about your background and career?
Sure. After the Naval Academy, I went aviation, flew in the back of the E-2C Hawkeye, which is the plane with the radar on top of aircraft carriers. Did a number of cruises, did a straight 20 years and then got out. And with that, I've been working in the defense contracting industry for a number of different companies for about the last 15 or 16 years. Along the way, I wanted to get some more degrees, if you will. So I first went with a military history degree. And then along the way, about 20 years ago, late 1990s or so, working on a PhD and really got into information and the power of information and how that was changing the world. And so as much as it was kind of started out to be like a foreign policy PhD, it then migrated over to more of a discussion of power and what is power and what are the how do you control power. And with that, I was talking with a number of different professors in universities in Great Britain and Australia, and eventually I ended up switching my PhD over to Australia, to Perth, because there was a professor there that was actually running this Journal of Information Warfare. He had just started in 2001, and he was kind of on the cutting edge of where I wanted to go. So I kind of aligned myself with him. And so I ended up getting a PhD in 2009. And with that, a couple of years later, around 2012, that professor retired from Edith Cowan University. And he asked me to pick up the journal if I would be interested in taking over as the chief editor. And so I did. And eventually a Peregrine Technical Solutions company I run ended up taking that over. And so it's a double-blind, peer-reviewed academic journal. We put out 4 issues a year. Some of the issues have been what we call special editions, where we collaborate with an organization because they want to focus on certain issues. For example, after Edwin Snowden incident, the NSA, National Security Agency, was looking to have some better news or better stories, public relations, if you will, about the NSA. So we collaborated in 2013 through 2017 to do 4 special editions with the NSA. And you got to realize that our journal is worldwide. We have viewers or readers, subscribers from around the world, including Russia and China, and it's unclassified. But we did 4 special editions with them. And since then, we've done other special editions. Last year in 2020, we did a special edition with Facebook. And we've also done 2 special editions with the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Now, the interesting part about that, the journal, is that it's the big tent when it comes to information warfare. So there are people that are talking about strategic communications, propaganda, perception management. And there's other people on the other side that are hardcore cybersecurity defense, cyber attacks, all sorts of. So it's very much a diverse group of papers that we get in that journal. And so basically that's how I got here. First the Navy, then through a PhD, and then I ended up owning a double-blind peer-reviewed academic journal.
By virtue of your experience and also as the editor of the journal, you are privileged, I suppose, to see a wide range of thought leadership and research that's related to the information problem. So you've got an interesting perspective. So how would you characterize the information related threats that we face? And in your opinion, what are our most urgent problems that we need to solve?
Let me address that from the 2 different angles that I mentioned about how it's such diverse readership and authors. So 20 years ago, when I was starting my PhD, and everybody was talking about the new information world and how great it was going to be and how we were all going to be able to have all this information at our fingertips. And John, you and I are of the age where we had to go buy encyclopedias to get through grade school and stuff like that. And now it's all out there. The problem is, and everybody's seeing it now, is that information has been weaponized, and it's become, when you look at, you were a former military officer as well, when you look at the different tools of war, if you will, whether it's air power or sea power or land power, what you're trying to do there is when you have power is the ability to make A to get B to do something that B didn't want to do. So whether that's bombing somebody or moving ships in or using submarines, foot soldiers, you're trying to make an organization, a country, a people change their mind, change their will. Well, we're able to do that as well with information. You can look at the last election, for example, and once again, being politically neutral, there was information campaigns being going on both sides. And political campaigns have always used information in that manner, but now there's ways to weaponize it where you can target it through Twitter or through different feeds that people get. And so information has become a weapon. There's an old professor, he passed away with cancer from National Defense University called Dan Keel. And he used an acronym called DIME. And basically it was defense, information, military, and economic. Diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And those were the powers that a country could use. Now, if you look at that, from defense, we have a defense department. We have Army, Navy, Air Force, and so forth. From a diplomatic, State Department. From economic, we have, Department of Commerce and also other economic efforts of leverage you can pull. But there's no defense or Department of Information. Information is diffuse. If you wanted to conduct a military campaign, it would cost you a lot to buy a tank, a ship, or an aircraft carrier. If you want to conduct an information campaign, you can do it in one room with a server, some sophisticated computers to manipulate for fake images and deep fakes, and you can basically be running an information campaign, and it doesn't cost you that much to do it. And you can also be very nimble. You can basically hide your tracks. We're seeing that a lot around the world where there are these information campaigns and you really have to dig to try to find who is behind it. So that's one side of the ledger. That's what's changed in the last 20 years, where we thought that this access to information would be this great nirvana and everybody would have this equal playing field. And what people are doing is they're using it to their advantage and they're weaponizing information. The other part, more from the cybersecurity aspect, is because everything's being connected and interconnected. You're no longer safe. I mean, John, in your house, you probably have one modem and one router. And that brings you your internet. And 5 years ago, it's probably the same thing. But now, compared to 5 years ago, you probably have a number of different Internet of Things or IoT types of devices. And your toaster's talking to your refrigerator, or just talking to your doorbell. And that's all different networks. 5 years from now, you'll probably still have that one modem router, but your house will be totally interconnected. And so that threat, that change of information is now devices are talking to each other. And a lot of times we don't even know they're talking to each other. We can't control that. So if you look out there, that goes to buildings, that goes to infrastructure, where they have concepts like software as a service. They have concepts such as lighting as a service. As you walk out of the grocery store, the aisles kind of light up because they know you're coming, and then they go dark. That's really smart. It saves energy. But what happens is we're interconnecting everything. So there are now huge threats to buildings, electrical, HVAC, water, because everything's being interconnected. And in one aspect, it's really good because you can save power, you can save electricity. On the other aspect, a lot of times people don't know those interconnections are being made. So a long story, but kind of collapse and bring it back down. Huge changes in the last two decades about how information is being weaponized, but also how information is interconnecting everything. And we're not quite sure how those interconnections are being made.
Right. And you guys just had one of your special issues on critical infrastructure specifically, did you not?
Yes, and that's why we've been collaborating with the Pacific Northwest National Lab out of Washington State for the last 2 years. We literally just yesterday or Tuesday pushed the button for the second edition. They're very much focused on critical infrastructure, and they're looking at how we can secure it, or how we can make it stronger. So that journal has a lot of formulas that it's really electricians, scientists, researchers, and yes, that's a critical area. Think about, your average building. I mean, you were in the military. You once again, those military buildings, they'll have their router for their internet protocol network, but think of all the different systems that are connected now with electrical, HVAC, and water, and that's going to be a huge threat going forward. We are currently working on a contract where we're actually running around a basis, and we're trying to lock down the buildings themselves from a cybersecurity aspect.
As a layman here trying to understand the information problem from all kinds of different vantages, I continually find myself a little stuck between cyber related threats and information related threats. And it seems like the two can be conflated easily, and yet they're also part of the same package. Could you tease that out just a little bit? Like for example, you're just describing how, there's all of these Internet of Things devices that are increasingly becoming interconnected with one another. How does that cyber-related phenomenon ladder up into information operations or an information warfare problem?
One of the things is they've had incidents where people have been able to turn on stoves and start a fire in your house because your stove or your new oven is connected to the internet. The same thing where they can cut off your power, cut off your water. So what is from a house, from a personal aspect, you should always try to put at least some passwords, put some sort of protection. There's 3-factor authentication. It's what you are, what you know, and what you have. Okay. So what you are is biometrics. It's a fingerprint, it's an iris scan. What you have is a token. And we've all had CAT cards and so forth like that. And what you know is a password. So at a minimum, on any sort of interconnected device, you should have at least 1 factor, a password, a token, or something. 2 factors even better. Rarely do civilians do 3-factor authentication, but you just need to think about when you connect this device or when you connect up to the internet with an IoT system, what kind of external threat can you have? And then from an information aspect, it's the same thing. So, when you and I were young, our parents told us, don't go down those dark alleys, or don't go into, that part of town may be a little dodgy or something like that. You need to tell your kids the same thing. You need to tell your fellow citizens the same thing. Don't go to these sites that click in and say you got $10,000 owed to you by some African warlord, or something like that, And if you don't know what the object is, don't click on it. There's terms called phishing and spear phishing, and they've gotten very, very sophisticated. Our company has gotten a lot of spear phishing attempts where somebody will have Leigh Armistead on the thing, and they'll actually have my boss's name on there, and they'll say, here's a document. I need you to open this up and review it. And it just sounds a little bit off. The spelling's a little bit off. The grammar's a little bit off. I talked to my boss yesterday. He didn't say I had any sort of document that I had to review. So you just go back up to our corporate IT person, go, is this phishing? He goes, yeah, it is. And they get very sophisticated. And so there's been lots of instances recently where people have lost their systems. They've had to pay ransomware. And once again, a lot of times it's about money. The criminal activity used to do it in a certain way before the internet. Now they're using the internet to basically get a lot of money and to basically have ways where they can steal money from you. They can ransomware, if you will. So it's brought up a threat where you don't have to go to that bad part of the town. The bad part of the town comes to you.
When you were talking there, it reminded me of a discussion that we had with Chase Cunningham, a previous podcast guest, where he was talking about how the bad guys are creatively stitching together some of these techniques, including deep fake videos and deep fake audios as well, to fool people. So like an audio could be like a deep fake recording of your supervisor's voice, calling in to say, hey, I'm not coming into work today, or something that completely disrupts the agenda for the day, and you wind up with people who are scheduled to be in the office, but then they're not in the office because their boss told them to stay home, and there's all kinds of things
Sure.
probably happening and are being planned to combine these kinds of techniques.
Yeah, you're exactly right. When you start combining physical threats with informational threats, it can be very effective. And once again, it's criminals or even foreign actors using the newest tools they can to take advantage of it. And it's a different playing field, if you will.
Yeah, so I guess we could think of all of this classically as a arms race, right? Where the good guys are figuring out ways to counter these types of threats, and the bad guys are trying to put together additional creative ways to attack organizations and even nation states and populations. What are some of the techniques or projects that you're aware of, Leigh, that organizations or nation states are pursuing in order to identify and stay ahead of these types of threats?
So look at Estonia, to start off with,
Yeah.
a Baltic nation. They were basically, their entire internet was taken down by the Russians, if you will, and kind of held hostage. And so there's now a huge center of excellence for information warfare there in Estonia. The same thing and back in mid 2014, 2015, when Russia invaded Crimea. If you remember there, they combined a physical assault on a nation, Ukraine, if you will, with an information campaign, because what they were doing is none of the soldiers or none of the units could be identified. They took all their patches off, their name tags off. There were no identification. They were just green men and green tanks, and there was a lot of obfuscation from Moscow, a lot of disinformation. And eventually what they kept saying is, we're just trying to bring liberty to the western part of Ukraine, which was traditionally under Russian control, And so basically they did. They took over a country. And usually what you and I were taught is sovereign nations, that's an act of war if you invade a sovereign nation. And yet no war was declared. And, and it's happening right now. Putin's in a little bit of a public relations problem with his counterpart, who he put in jail. And he also is trying to divert attention from a lot of that. So he's mounting a military campaign right now in Crimea, in Ukraine. And so what happens is, information by itself will not win a war, but it's now a component, So if you remember Bosnia back in 1994, a lot of times when we think of how we're going to inflict a campaign, we'll do a naval campaign or an air campaign, and a lot of times, aerial bombardment is great because it's surgical, if you will, although we know in Vietnam it was never surgical. But NATO was actually doing a bombing campaign against Milosevic there, and they literally had about a 3-day list of targets to bomb. And then once he didn't give up, they just kept bombing similar type, same targets, and eventually the rubble just starts bouncing, because there's no, and they're not changing his mind. So I think around day 51, they finally said, what else can we do? And they said, let's do an information campaign. And the only way Milosevic was staying in power was because he had a bunch of his cronies. And once you start targeting his cronies and their businesses, and some of the stuff is very simple, like leaving a piece of paper underneath the windshield wiper of the guy's car saying, we know who you are, we know where your bank assets are, we know the name of your family. And also the cronies started backing away from Milosevic. And very quickly his support died. And so it comes down to the power of information. In that same similar time frame in the mid-90s, in Rwanda, you had hundreds of thousands of people that were killed in a genocide campaign over radio broadcast. And so information and power, look today. Today we have our country, we had an election 3 months ago, and whatever side you're on, that's fine. But there's still kind of ramifications coming from that election with whether you're on the right or the left. They're doing their information war campaigns, and they're trying to talk to their base and so forth. So what's happened is, it used to be your information came from your newspaper, or maybe came from a radio, or 3 channels, CBS, ABC, and NBC that everybody watched, and we kind of all got the common news. Now we're kind of siloed. People want to get the information that they want to hear. So whether you're going to listen to this radio station or that internet podcasting, or that app, and so people maybe they don't have the common collective knowledge that we used to have before. So information truly is power, and it can be weaponized, it can be used, and we see it every day, not only in the United States, but even in your local community. And so it's very valuable, and the way you can do it is really cheap. It's really cheap to basically put out a podcast or put out a Twitter tweet, and so the cost of actually doing a campaign has been greatly reduced.
As we read a few moments ago in your bio, you received your doctorate from Edith Cowan University, which is located in Australia, and you're also a retired Navy officer. How would you say these experiences have shaped your perspective on information warfare?
Well, I think, once again, if you get a chance to be in the military, you get a chance to see the world. And you're not just US focused. And I think, you feel blessed that we have a country that's not always being invaded, from either Canada or Mexico. Hasn't happened in 200 years. But you also realize that, there are chances to do good out there in the world. There are chances to allow people to live in peace and so forth. So I think from a military aspect, and I think, John, you might have seen this as well, there's a lot of military folks that aren't like ready to go to war. They want to go out there and they want to do their job. They want to protect the United States, but they're not necessarily wanting to run into every country and invade it. In fact, a lot of times the military officers, especially the senior ones, are the most cautious about starting any type of military operation, because the Vietnam era is kind of gone now. But right now, Afghanistan, we're finally getting out of Afghanistan after 20 years. And the military officers have seen death. They've seen their friends lost in aircraft accidents or on the ground and so forth, and they know how costly it is to conduct a military campaign. So I think that makes you a little more worldly, say, than some of your counterparts, but also makes you maybe a little more cautious. And then having done my PhD remotely and with Australia, I'm also very connected with a bunch of academics in Europe and so forth like that. They have their own viewpoint of what not only the United States should be doing, but what NATO should be doing, what the Five Eyes, if you will, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, Canada, US, Great Britain. With this power, or with this capability, comes a lot of need to try to stabilize regions. If you really want to look at it from a market perspective, you want to have countries all relatively stable, that they can buy products, that they can ship products, that they can rise the level of human economy and well-being. So there is a lot of, I think, perspective you get from having traveled, from having worked with other countries and people around the world. I think I've been lucky to have that experience.
Right. Is there anything specific that you've observed that, say, for example, the Australian government, how they perceive the information threat differently than the United States does?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I actually had a brief, I still use it occasionally, where I would compare the US response to like the Australian response. And the incidents were, the Twin Towers in 2001. And then there was this huge attack in Bali a year or two after that, where a lot of Australian tourists were killed in a terrorist attack. It really comes down to scale a lot. As much as Australia is probably about 80% of the landmass of the continental United States, it has tremendously less people. I mean, like the entire Australian Navy is basically equivalent to one carrier battle group for us, you know, and we have 11 carrier battle groups right now. So the scale of what the United States tries to do around the world can't compare to Great Britain or Australia. They operate more as a regional power. If you look at Australia, their biggest threat is from China. They are solely focused on looking north, and that northern tier of Australia, the Royal Australian Army, that's what they are focused on. You talk to a bunch of those folks, they want to keep the sea lines and communications open, and they're an island nation, Australia, so they're totally dependent on trade. You know, most of the folks are on the East Coast. Perth is way out to the west, and there's nothing in between, you know, and so they very much have a different perspective. They are, I think it really comes down to scale. They're amazed sometimes how big not only are the services in the US, but we also have these extra services like the Coast Guard, like the Maritime Marine, you know, some of our police departments, the Customs and Border Patrol. We just keep adding all these organizations that overwhelm any of our European fellow nations or Australia or New Zealand. I think the size and scope is the huge difference where we have much more capability than those nations do. They're very good in those regional areas, but they're not going to project global power like the United States.
Yeah, a different set of national security challenges, or custom set of problems
Sure.
From the Australian perspective, for sure. Could we turn back to the Journal of Information Warfare
Sure.
for a moment? We spoke about this before we started recording, but you mentioned that the journal is coming up on its 20th anniversary. Is that correct?
It is. The original editor, Dr. Bill Hutchinson, who was my advisor at Edith Cowan, he started this, and he's still affiliated with the journal. And so what we're doing is we're actually doing a special edition here in 2021, where we're going to go back to all the original authors who are still with us, and we're asking them to write a new article and to take and look at what they thought the world would look like from an information warfare aspect back in 2000, 2001, and then where is it now 20 years later? So we're really excited about this special edition that's going to come out later this year. And the perspectives are going to be kind of like I alluded to earlier, where I think everybody was more of a utopian viewpoint back then. Because if you remember, you probably remember in the late 90s, before 9/11, they were really minimizing some of the military presence. They were taking the guards off some of the bases around the United States. And it was a kinder, peaceler nation, and we weren't going to have any of these conflicts. And all of a sudden 9/11 hit, and we went back a different direction. So that original journal was written before 9/11, in that part of the year. So we're excited about that. And then we're also looking at other personnel who maybe didn't write that first edition, but were part of that cohort. Because once again, not everybody that wrote is still with us, and we want to flesh it out. So we're kind of having people look back over the last 2 decades of what's changed in information warfare and where they think it's going in the future.
Yeah, that's a very cool idea. It'll be interesting to see these authors, I guess, maybe critiquing themselves
Yes.
a little bit, and talking about what they got right, what they got wrong, and why. And of course, we will have a link to the journal in the show notes for our audience to go and check out. Could we conclude, Leigh, by asking you since you do a lot of reading, obviously, are there any books or online resources that you could recommend to our audience?
Sure. There's an author that I like. His name is James Gleick, Gleick, James Gleick. And he wrote a bunch of books talking about information warfare, talking about the power of information. One was called What Just Happened, and then the other one's called Faster. So James Gleick is a great author I like. And then I got a lot of inspiration. I got a lot of guidance from this former professor named Dan Keel from National Defense University. He passed away with cancer, but he was a great contributor. I did end up writing 3 books on information warfare and information operations along the way, and he was a co-author on a couple of those. I would like to put out to anybody that if they're interested in subscribing to the journal, we have a bunch of different options that make it very easy to do, and not that expensive, especially if you want to do like an online subscription. Those are very, very inexpensive. We have options for students, whether if you're an undergraduate or a graduate student. And then for those that are professional and those that are really interested in information warfare, we have a really good deal. We can let you be a reviewer on the journal. And if you review 2 or 3 papers a year, we'll give you a free subscription. And you need to come with some sort of expertise around information warfare. But once again, it could come from that entire broad spectrum. You could be hardcore cyber security, defense, attack. You can be way over on perception management, strategic communications. But it's a bunch of like-minded souls that are collaborating on these journals. And then another plug I'd like to do is, if you're really into information warfare, there's 3 different conferences that you may want to attend. They're for academics, they're for professionals, they're for operators. One's in Australia, one's in the United States, and one's in Europe. And we can put the links in to those different conferences into this podcast. And they occur each year. Obviously, with COVID, they're being virtual right now. But the Australian one's normally in December, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. The one in the United States is normally in late February, early March, usually around spring break. And then the European one is usually the last week of June or the first week of July, coinciding with the July 4th holiday. And they're not that expensive, and you can go and attend. So if you really want to get more involved with information warfare, I highly recommend you attend or write a paper for some of those conferences.
All right. Well, thank you for those suggestions, and we will have links to those in the show notes. And with that, Dr. Leigh Armistead, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you. This was fun.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.